There are forms of emotional pain so thoroughly internalized that they become invisible to external observation, where the gap between internal experience and external presentation is so complete that witnesses mistake composure for absence of feeling, where the discipline of maintaining dignity under extraordinary duress creates performance so convincing that even people who know the sufferer well cannot detect the suffering occurring beneath the controlled surface. Elara Singh had mastered this particular form of emotional management over 27 years of navigating life circumstances that had required her to develop exceptional capacity for bearing pain privately while maintaining functional public presentation, had learned through accumulated necessity that expressing vulnerability often created more problems than it solved, that maintaining composure allowed her to continue meeting her obligations even when internal resources felt completely depleted. The morning of her wedding, Saturday, October 23, unseasonably warm for autumn in the mid-Atlantic region where Verona Heights was located, Elara woke at 5:47 a.m. in the guest room of her parents' house where she'd been staying for the past week in accordance with tradition about bride and groom not seeing each other immediately before the ceremony. The room was the same room she'd occupied during her childhood and adolescence, still contained the furniture and decorations from those earlier periods even though she'd been living independently for nearly a decade, still felt simultaneously familiar and strange in the way childhood spaces feel when you return to them as adult whose identity has diverged substantially from the person who originally occupied those spaces. She lay in bed for several minutes before rising, staring at the ceiling with its familiar water stain from roof leak that had been repaired years ago but that had left permanent mark, feeling the particular quality of awareness that comes from knowing you're about to engage in significant life event, feeling the absence that would characterize that event, feeling the complicated emotional state that she'd been managing for the past 8 days since receiving the news that had transformed her wedding from celebration into ordeal. The church where the ceremony would be held was St. Catherine's, a Catholic church in Verona Heights Historic District approximately 15 minutes from her parents' house, a building that dated from the 1920s and that represented the kind of substantial stone construction characteristic of that era's religious architecture. The interior featured high vaulted ceilings, stained glass windows depicting various saints and biblical scenes, wooden pews that had been polished by decades of congregants, marble altar that had been imported from Italy during the church's original construction. The space could accommodate approximately 300 people though Elara and Arjun's wedding would have only about 140 guests, substantial gathering but not filling the church's full capacity. The church had been decorated the previous evening by wedding coordinator and volunteer helpers, had been transformed from its normal austere appearance into something more festive and romantic through addition of white roses arranged in large displays at the altar and at the ends of each pew row, candles and tall holders creating soft lighting that supplemented the autumn sunlight filtering through the stained glass, white fabric draped in careful arrangements that softened the stone architecture without obscuring it. The decorations had cost approximately $3,200, had been selected months earlier when Elara and Arjun had been planning the wedding together, had been installed according to those plans even though the circumstances that had motivated those aesthetic choices had been completely transformed. The air inside the church on the morning of the ceremony, Elara would arrive there around 10:30 a.m. for photographs before the 11 a.m. ceremony start time, carried the particular scent that characterizes religious spaces, combination of stone and wood, residual incense from previous services, the roses that had been brought in for the wedding decorations, candle wax from the dozens of candles that had been lit to create the desired atmospheric lighting. The scent would be one of the sensory details that Elara would remember most clearly from the day, would become associated in her memory with the complicated emotional experience of performing wedding ceremony without the groom whose presence was supposed to be its central element. Outside the church, Verona Heights was experiencing typical autumn Saturday morning activity. The historic district where St. Catherine's was located included mixture of residential and commercial properties, Victorian and early 20th century houses that had been maintained as single-family homes or converted into professional offices, small businesses catering to neighborhood residents and to tourists who visited the historic district, a farmer's market that operated on Saturday mornings in the town square approximately 3 blocks from the church. The streets were busy with people buying produce and baked goods, walking dogs, running errands, conducting the ordinary weekend activities that constituted normal urban life. The contrast between that ordinary activity and what was occurring inside the church would be stark. Outside, people were living regular Saturdays without awareness that a few blocks away a young woman was performing her wedding ceremony alone, was maintaining composed dignity while experiencing grief that most people would find overwhelming. The contrast wasn't dramatic in external manifestation, wasn't visible to casual observers, was just the usual gap between private suffering and public normalcy that characterizes urban life, where millions of individual experiences occur simultaneously without most people being aware of what others are experiencing beyond their immediate social circles. Elara had spent the week since receiving the news about Arjun's accident navigating the question of whether to proceed with the wedding ceremony at all. The accident had occurred in Mumbai, where Arjun had been visiting family and attending to business matters related to his work as software consultant specializing in financial systems implementation. He'd been passenger in car driven by his cousin when they'd been struck by truck whose driver had run red light, had sustained multiple serious injuries including broken pelvis, fractured ribs, significant head trauma that had required surgery to relieve intracranial pressure. He'd survived. The doctors had been clear about that from the beginning, had emphasized that while his injuries were serious they weren't immediately life-threatening, that with appropriate treatment and rehabilitation he would eventually recover, though the timeline would be measured in months rather than weeks. But he was unable to travel, would remain hospitalized in Mumbai for at least 6 to 8 weeks, would then require extended rehabilitation before being medically cleared for international flight back to the United States. The wedding had been planned for months, had involved substantial financial investment and logistical coordination, had required booking the church and reception venue and caterer and photographer and various other vendors whose services had been reserved for this specific date. The practical question was whether those arrangements could or should be cancelled given that the groom would be unable to attend, whether it made sense to postpone the entire event until Arjun could be present, whether there was value in proceeding with some modified version of the ceremony that would acknowledge his absence while still marking the intended wedding date. The wedding coordinator, a professional named Monica Reeves who managed these events as full-time business, had been pragmatic about the options. Most vendors would not refund deposits for cancellations with less than 30 days' notice, which meant canceling would mean losing approximately $18,000 in non-refundable payments. Postponing would require finding new date when all the same vendors were available, which was unlikely given that popular venues and vendors were typically booked months in advance, would probably mean substantially different wedding than what had been planned. Proceeding with modified ceremony would preserve the investment already made, would allow family and friends who'd made travel arrangements to still gather, would mark the intended date even if it couldn't fulfill its original purpose. Elara's family had been divided about what to do. Her mother had advocated for cancellation despite the financial loss, had argued that proceeding without Arjun present would be too emotionally painful for Elara, that the wedding should wait until they could celebrate together properly. Her father had been more pragmatic, had noted that the money was already spent regardless of whether they cancelled, that having some kind of gathering might provide closure or might create positive memory associated with the date that would otherwise just be associated with disappointment and loss. Elara herself had been uncertain, had spent days considering the options without arriving at clear preference, had felt paralyzed by the decision in ways that were unusual for her given that she typically had strong capacity for making difficult choices under pressure. The paralysis reflected the fact that all the options felt wrong in different ways. Canceling felt like giving up, postponing felt like pretending the current situation wasn't happening, proceeding felt like performing charade that would make everyone uncomfortable. Eventually she'd decided to proceed with modified ceremony, not because that option felt right but because it felt least wrong, because it would honor the commitments that had been made and the preparations that had been completed, because it would give her something concrete to focus on during the difficult period when Arjun was hospitalized and she couldn't be with him, because performing the ceremony might provide some psychological closure even if it couldn't provide the actual marriage it was meant to formalize. The decision had required informing all the guests about the situation, that Arjun had been in serious accident, that he was recovering but couldn't travel, that Elara had decided to proceed with gathering of family and friends on the planned wedding date even though actual marriage wouldn't occur until Arjun could be present. The notifications had been sent via email and phone calls, had generated various responses ranging from supportive to confused to concerned about Elara's emotional state and whether proceeding was healthy choice or was indication that she was in denial about the gravity of the situation. But Elara had been firm about her decision once it was made, had proceeded with final wedding preparations with same composed efficiency that characterized her general approach to managing difficult circumstances. Had attended final dress fitting, had confirmed arrangements with caterer and photographer, had reviewed ceremony program with the priest who would be officiating, had done everything that would normally be done in final week before wedding except that she'd done it with knowledge that the ceremony would be fundamentally different from what had been originally planned. The morning of the wedding, Elara had been attended by her 2 bridesmaids, her younger sister Maya and her closest friend from college, a woman named Priya who'd flown in from Seattle for the wedding and who'd stayed to support Elara even after learning about Arjun's accident and about the modified ceremony plan. They'd helped her dress in the ivory gown that had been selected months earlier, had arranged her hair according to the style they'd practiced during previous preparation session, had applied her makeup with care to ensure it looked natural while still being appropriate for photographs. Maya had cried while helping Elara dress, had been unable to maintain composure in face of the situation's sadness, had apologized for crying when Elara herself wasn't crying. Elara had comforted her sister gently, had assured her that tears were appropriate response to sad situation, had maintained her own composure partly because someone needed to remain functional and partly because allowing herself to begin crying might mean being unable to stop, might mean complete breakdown that would make proceeding with the ceremony impossible. They'd arrived at the church at 10:35 a.m., slightly later than the planned 10:30 arrival time due to traffic delay caused by accident on the route from Elara's parents' house. The photographer had been waiting, had begun taking pre-ceremony photographs in the church's side rooms and gardens, images of Elara alone in her wedding gown, images of Elara with her bridesmaids, images of family members, all the standard wedding photography that would normally include groom but that in this case documented bride alone preparing for ceremony that would proceed without him. The photographs were a strange experience for Elara, performing the poses and expressions that wedding photography typically requires while being acutely aware that the person who should have been central to these images was absent, that the photographs were documenting something that wasn't quite what they appeared to be documenting, that anyone viewing these images in the future would need explanation about why the groom wasn't present in what were supposed to be wedding day photographs. At 10:55 a.m., guests began arriving at the church, entering through the main doors and being directed by ushers to appropriate seating sections. The guests' expressions as they entered revealed their uncertainty about how to respond to the situation. This was gathering that resembled wedding in all its external features but that everyone knew wasn't actually wedding, was ceremony whose purpose had been transformed in ways that made standard wedding etiquette feel inadequate or inappropriate. Some guests had chosen not to attend after learning about the modified plans, had sent regrets and well wishes, had decided that attending gathering to mark wedding that wasn't occurring would be too sad or too awkward. But most had come, had made the choice to support Elara by being present even though the occasion was painful, had filled approximately 120 of the 140 seats that had been reserved for the event. At 11:03 a.m., the ceremony began. Music played, the processional piece that Elara and Arjun had selected months earlier, performed by string quartet positioned in the church's choir loft. The bridesmaids walked down the aisle in their planned order, wearing the deep burgundy dresses that had been chosen to complement Elara's ivory gown. Then Elara herself, walking alone down the aisle because her father had offered to escort her but she'd decided that having him give her away when there was no groom present to receive her would feel too painful, that walking alone would be more honest acknowledgement of the situation. The walk down the aisle was perhaps 90 seconds, felt much longer, required Elara to maintain composed expression while being observed by 120 people who were watching with mixture of sympathy and admiration and concern. The church was completely silent except for the music, no whispered conversations, no shuffling or coughing, just profound stillness that suggested the guests understood they were witnessing something significant even if they weren't quite sure what they were witnessing. Elara reached the altar, turned to face the assembled guests. The priest, Father Michael, an elderly man who'd been at St. Catherine's for 30 years and who'd agreed to conduct this modified ceremony after discussing with Elara what its purpose and structure would be, welcomed everyone and acknowledged the unusual circumstances directly rather than pretending this was normal wedding ceremony. We gathered today to honor a commitment that Elara and Arjun made to each other, to mark the date they had chosen to formalize their union, to support Elara during a difficult time when the celebration they had planned cannot proceed as intended. This is not a wedding that will occur when Arjun is able to be present. But it is a gathering of community, an affirmation of love that persists even when circumstances prevent its immediate fulfillment, a testament to Elara's strength and dignity in the face of profound disappointment. The acknowledgement was direct, was honest in ways that made the ceremony's purpose clear rather than leaving guests confused about what was happening. Father Michael continued with modified version of traditional wedding ceremony structure, readings that Elara and Arjun had selected, reflections about love and commitment and perseverance through difficulty, prayers for Arjun's recovery and for Elara's strength during the waiting period. Throughout the ceremony, Elara remained standing at the altar, her expression composed, her posture upright, her hands folded calmly in front of her. She didn't cry, didn't show visible signs of distress, didn't perform any of the emotional displays that guests had been anticipating or bracing themselves for. Her composure was so complete that several guests later reported feeling concerned that she was in shock or denial, that her lack of visible emotion suggested she wasn't processing the situation's reality. But Elara was processing everything. Was acutely aware of every element of the ceremony, of every word Father Michael spoke, of every gaze from the assembled guests, of the profound sadness of standing alone at altar where she'd imagined standing with Arjun, of the effort required to maintain composure when every instinct was screaming to collapse or flee or express the overwhelming grief and disappointment that she was experiencing internally. The internal experience was chaotic even while external presentation remained controlled. Her mind was simultaneously tracking multiple streams of awareness, the ceremony's progression, the need to respond appropriately when required, the management of her breathing and posture to prevent visible signs of distress, the acute missing of Arjun's presence, the knowledge that he was in hospital bed thousands of miles away probably thinking about this ceremony and wishing he could be present, the awareness that maintaining composure was gift she was giving to everyone present by not forcing them to witness her complete breakdown. The discipline required to maintain this composed presentation while experiencing such intense internal turmoil was extraordinary, was drawing on reserves of strength that Elara had developed over years of managing difficult circumstances. Her childhood had involved her mother's extended illness that had required Elara to assume adult responsibilities while still young, had taught her that expressing vulnerability often meant creating additional burden for others who were already overwhelmed. Her adolescence had involved her father's job loss and the family's subsequent financial difficulties that had required everyone to maintain optimistic public face while managing private anxiety about whether they'd lose their house. Her young adulthood had involved series of losses and disappointments that had reinforced the lesson that maintaining composure allowed you to continue functioning when breaking down would have been catastrophic. So she'd learned to internalize pain, to present calm exterior while managing intense internal experience, to perform strength even when feeling completely depleted. The wedding ceremony was just the most extreme application of this learned capacity, was test of whether she could maintain composure under circumstances that would break most people's ability to manage their emotional presentation. The ceremony concluded after approximately 35 minutes. Father Michael offered final blessing, the string quartet played recessional music, Elara walked back down the aisle alone while guests stood and watched with expressions that mixed admiration for her composure with concern about whether that composure was healthy or was indication of serious emotional suppression that would eventually create problems. The reception was held at a restaurant called the Meridian, located approximately 10 minutes from St. Catherine's, that had private event space that could accommodate the 140 guests who'd been invited, though only about 115 actually attended the reception given that some who'd come to the ceremony had opted out of the reception portion of the event. The space had been decorated similarly to the church, white roses, candles, white fabric creating romantic atmospheric lighting, all the standard wedding reception aesthetics applied to gathering that wasn't quite wedding reception. The meal was served family style with guests seated at round tables of 8, eating the food that had been selected months earlier during menu tasting sessions with the caterer. The conversation at tables was subdued, people were uncertain about appropriate tone for this gathering, were trying to honor Elara's choice to proceed while also acknowledging that the situation was fundamentally sad, were navigating the gap between normal wedding reception behavior and whatever this modified event called for. Elara moved between tables during the meal, thanking guests for attending, accepting their expressions of support and concern, maintaining the composed, gracious demeanor that had characterized her presence throughout the day. Several guests commented on her strength, her dignity, her remarkable composure under such difficult circumstances. Elara accepted these comments with small smile and brief acknowledgement, didn't elaborate on what maintaining that composure was requiring, didn't reveal the exhaustion and emotional depletion that were accumulating beneath the surface presentation. There were no toasts, that had seemed too painful to attempt, would have required someone to speak about Arjun's absence in ways that might have broken Elara's composure or might have created too much sadness for guests to manage. There was no first dance, no cake cutting, none of the traditional wedding reception activities that would have felt grotesque or inappropriate given the circumstances. Just meal and quiet conversation and gradual departure as guests finished eating and decided there was no reason to extend the gathering beyond what was necessary. By 3:30 p.m., most guests had departed. Elara remained at the Meridian with her immediate family and closest friends, sitting at one of the round tables, finally allowing herself to relax slightly now that the performance was essentially complete. Maya sat beside her holding her hand, not speaking, just providing physical presence and support. Priya sat across from her, occasionally offering observations about how well everything had gone, how beautifully Elara had handled an impossibly difficult situation, how proud Arjun would be of her strength and dignity. Elara appreciated these comments even as she found them slightly uncomfortable. The praise felt unearned somehow, felt like people were attributing moral strength to what had really just been practiced emotional suppression, were interpreting her composure as virtue rather than as potentially problematic inability to express genuine feeling. But she accepted the praise graciously, allowed people to interpret her behavior in whatever ways made sense to them, didn't attempt to correct their understanding because explaining the actual internal experience would have required vulnerability she still couldn't access. Around 4 p.m., Elara's father suggested they should leave, that Elara had fulfilled all the obligations the day had required and should now rest. Elara agreed, gathered her things, said goodbyes to remaining family and friends, allowed her father to drive her back to her parents' house where she would stay for the next few days before returning to her own apartment. In the car during the drive, her father said, "You were incredibly strong today. I know how difficult that was. I'm proud of you." Elara thanked him quietly, looked out the window at the familiar streets of Verona Heights passing by, felt the exhaustion that had been building throughout the day finally becoming overwhelming now that she could allow it to manifest. That evening, after changing out of her wedding gown and into comfortable clothing, after declining her mother's offers of dinner because she had no appetite, Elara sat alone in her childhood bedroom and finally allowed herself to cry. Not dramatically, not with loud sobbing or visible distress that would alert her family, just quiet tears that flowed steadily while she sat on her bed staring at nothing in particular, finally releasing some portion of the emotion she'd been containing throughout the day. The crying lasted perhaps 20 minutes, was relief without being catharsis, was partial release rather than complete expression of what she'd been managing. After it subsided, Elara felt slightly better, not happy, not even approaching normal emotional state, but at least having acknowledged to herself that the day had been terrible even though she'd succeeded in performing it without breaking down publicly. She called the hospital in Mumbai where Arjun was being treated, managed to reach him despite the time zone difference and despite the hospital's limited visiting hours and communication policies. His voice when he answered was weak, was affected by pain medication and by the physical trauma he'd sustained, but was unmistakably him, was the person she'd been missing throughout the day. "How was it?" he asked, meaning the ceremony, meaning the gathering that had proceeded without him. "It was fine," Elara said, her voice carefully controlled despite the emotion rising in her throat. "Everyone was there. It was beautiful. But I missed you." "I'm so sorry I couldn't be there," Arjun said, his voice breaking slightly. "I wanted to be there so badly. I kept thinking about you standing at the altar alone and I can't even describe how that felt. I know, Elara said. But you're going to recover. And when you're able to travel, we'll have the actual wedding. This was just, I don't know what it was, exactly. Just marking the date, I guess. Honoring our original plan even though we couldn't fulfill it. They talked for another 15 minutes, speaking about his medical progress and about the ceremony's details and about their plans for when he'd be able to return to the United States. The conversation was sustaining in ways that the entire day's activities hadn't been, provided connection that Elara had been needing, reminded her that the relationship they were building still existed even though the wedding ceremony that was meant to formalize it had been derailed. After ending the call, Elara sat for a while longer in her bedroom, processing the day's events, beginning the work of integrating this experience into her understanding of herself and her relationship and her capacity for managing difficulty. The integration would take time, wouldn't be completed in single evening or single week, would be ongoing process that would continue through the months of Arjun's recovery and through whatever came after. Arjun returned to the United States in early February, approximately 3.5 months after his accident. His recovery had been slower than initially projected, the head trauma had created ongoing issues with headaches and fatigue, the broken pelvis had required longer rehabilitation than the doctors had anticipated, various complications had extended his hospitalization and delayed his medical clearance for international travel. Elara had visited him twice during those months, had taken vacation time to fly to Mumbai and spend weeks at a time supporting his recovery, had navigated the complex logistics of international travel and hospital visiting and cultural differences that characterized medical care in India versus in the United States. The visits had been difficult, seeing Arjun in hospital bed, observing his pain and frustration with the slow recovery process, managing her own emotional reactions while trying to provide support rather than adding to his stress. But the visits had also deepened their relationship in ways that the original wedding couldn't have achieved. Had required them to navigate genuine difficulty together, to support each other through extended crisis, to demonstrate commitment through sustained action rather than through single ceremonial event. Had proved that their relationship could survive serious disruption, that their care for each other extended beyond the romance and excitement that had characterized their courtship into the more difficult territory of managing actual hardship together. When Arjun finally returned to the United States in February, Elara met him at the airport. The reunion was emotional, tears that Elara hadn't cried at her wedding ceremony finally flowing freely as she held him in the airport terminal. Relief and joy at his presence overwhelming the composure she'd maintained for months, allowing herself finally to be vulnerable in ways she hadn't permitted during the ceremony or during the difficult months of waiting. They married quietly in March, at City Hall, with just immediate family present and with no elaborate ceremony or reception. The simplicity felt appropriate after the complexity of the October ceremony, felt like honest acknowledgement that the legal and spiritual aspects of marriage didn't require elaborate performance, felt like they were claiming their relationship on their own terms rather than according to conventions about how weddings were supposed to proceed. Elara never explained to most people what the October ceremony had actually been, how much effort had been required to maintain composure, how complete her internal breakdown had been even while external presentation remained controlled, how the strength that people had praised had really been elaborate performance that had required every ounce of discipline she possessed. The experience remained mostly private, was shared only with Arjun and with her closest family members who'd witnessed what maintaining that composure had cost her. But the experience had taught her something about herself, that her capacity for enduring difficulty without breaking down was both strength and potential problem, that the ability to internalize pain while maintaining functional external presentation was valuable skill that had allowed her to navigate the impossible situation, but that was also strategy that couldn't be relied upon indefinitely, that eventually would require acknowledging and processing the emotions she'd been suppressing. The lesson informed how she and Arjun approached their marriage. They built practices of honest communication about difficulty, of not requiring each other to maintain composed presentations when experiencing genuine struggle, of creating space for vulnerability that Elara had learned to suppress during her childhood and young adulthood. The practices weren't always successful. Old patterns of emotional suppression don't reverse completely just because you recognize they're problematic, but they represented commitment to building relationship that allowed authentic feeling rather than requiring constant performance of strength. 5 years after the October ceremony, Elara and Arjun attended wedding of Elara's sister Maya. During the reception, Maya made a toast that mentioned Elara's October ceremony, described it as demonstration of extraordinary strength that had inspired Maya's own approach to managing difficulty. Elara felt complicated about the description, appreciated her sister's recognition but also felt that the praise was attributing virtue to what had really been just survival strategy, was making heroic what had really been just person navigating impossible situation with whatever tools were available. But she accepted the toast graciously, thanked her sister, allowed the interpretation to stand even though it wasn't quite accurate to her own understanding of what had occurred. The gap between how others perceived her composure and how she'd experienced maintaining that composure was something she'd learned to live with, was just part of the complexity of being person whose external presentation didn't match internal experience, whose strength was real but was also performance that required constant management and that occasionally required acknowledging how much that performance cost. Strength does not always show. Sometimes endurance is silent. Sometimes the most profound demonstrations of resilience occur in internal spaces that external observers cannot access, where maintaining composed presentation while experiencing overwhelming internal turmoil requires discipline that goes unrecognized precisely because it's successful, where the absence of visible breakdown is misinterpreted as absence of genuine feeling rather than as evidence of extraordinary capacity for managing feeling privately. Elara's story isn't celebration of emotional suppression or argument that people should always maintain composure regardless of circumstances. Emotional expression is legitimate and necessary, vulnerability is strength rather than weakness, allowing others to witness your pain can create connection and support that performing strength prevents. The point isn't that Elara's approach was ideal or should be emulated universally. The point is that different people manage difficulty differently, that some people have learned through necessity to internalize pain while maintaining functional presentation, that the absence of visible emotional display doesn't mean absence of genuine feeling, that composed dignity under extreme duress is legitimate response even if it's not the only legitimate response or even the healthiest response. So if you're someone who manages difficulty through maintaining composure, who internalizes pain while presenting calm exterior, who's been praised for strength that feels more like survival than virtue, know that your approach is legitimate even if it's also potentially costly, that maintaining composed presentation while experiencing internal turmoil is real form of strength even if it's also strategy that requires eventual processing of emotions you've been suppressing. And if you're someone who encounters others who maintain composure under circumstances where you'd expect visible distress, don't assume their composure means they're not suffering, don't interpret absence of tears as absence of pain, don't mistake performed strength for actual absence of need for support. Offer support anyway, create space for vulnerability even if it's not immediately accessed, recognize that some people's strength manifests as endurance rather than as visible resilience. Carry your burdens with whatever dignity is available to you. Express your pain when expression is possible and helpful. But also recognize that sometimes circumstances require endurance without expression, require managing overwhelming internal experience while maintaining composed external presentation, require strength that manifests as silence rather than as visible demonstration. Strength does not always show. Sometimes, endurance is silent. Be StoryWise.